It's time to cover the topic of musical form. Formal structure concerns the largest relationships between song sections, but also the ways different, smaller levels, like those that include phrases and gestures, relate to each other. At the deepest level, the Beatles are largely conventional in piling up verses that are contrasted against bridges, possibly including a chorus, usually attaching introductory and concluding passages, and sometimes taking an instrumental break, like a guitar solo. Especially considering phrase rhythm, a topic we covered in the first rhythm video, and harmonic function, which we will introduce here and to which we will devote a number of forthcoming videos. Closer looks at the inner lives within these sections will show amazing variety among structures. Every song breathes in its own way, and the most unusual formal relationships that will appear later in songs such as I Am the Walrus and Martha My Dear and the entire Abbey Road medley have their roots in the Beatles' first recordings. I've just mentioned rhythm and harmony, but all materials, including texture, color, and melodic direction, help shape formal design and contribute to an understanding of what multiple level functions any moment fulfills in relation to its surroundings. Although it may come to seem that I'll be describing and classifying abstract entities and relationships, the study of form is an important path to the interpretation of emotional meaning, which is principally expressed through tension and relaxation. You will get the most out of this video, it'll seem much less abstract, if you listen to the examples I mention in order to hear the ideas and relationships I'm discussing. The key concepts in the exposition and development of the artistic representation of ideas include repetition, contrast, and return, along with opening and closing. Repetition engenders confidence. Contrast can suggest adventure, deeper exploration, or conflict. Return brings the comfort of the familiar, and an ornamented return can show how a just completed contrasting section can ramp up the character of material we already know. The ordering and placement of events, the how and when of manipulating elements that bring tension and release to their full potential, is something in which the Beatles excelled. Lyrics often reflect the structural relations of the music to which they're set. Refining the placement of shrieks taken from Little Richard, or the augmented triad taken from the Crickets and Carl Perkins, presented with the Tin Pan Alley logic of a Meredith Willson Broadway tune, or a pop hit by Carole King, led a mid-1963 combination of words and music to the most dramatic records since Johnny Ray, Elvis Presley, the Platters, and Jackie Wilson boiled over with passionate, improvisatory, retransitional melismas. We aim to help you understand how that all works. In this video, we'll cover two smaller forms that group individual phrases into sections known as the 12-bar blues and the period, and several larger structures that group together sections called verse, chorus, and bridge, and shape them along with instrumental breaks into complete songs. In tapes made in the spring of 1960, we hear the Beatles learning their guitars through the 12-bar blues, one example of which, entitled Cayenne, is heard on the anthology set. The 12-bar pattern is an example of a very old structure, the bar form, which dates to the 15th century. The bar form presents three phrases, the first two of which are the same or similar, the third contrasting. In the blues of the early 20th century, the first two lines, 4 bars each, contain the same words, which change in the third line, also of 4 bars. Pop and rock musicians typically keep the same tune in the first two lines, changing it for the third, although the words do not usually repeat as in the classic forebears. We can use the lowercase letters A and B to indicate repetition, contrast, and return, as in, say, an AABA form. We call this the design symbol. The three phrases of the blues can have an AAB form, or if the second phrase is like the first but different in some measurable way, we'd call it A''B. In addition to the melody, the 12-bar blues has a very consistent harmonic and phrase rhythm plan, like this. The first phrase contains 4 bars of the 1 chord, which I will represent with the Roman numeral and explain in a moment. The second phrase follows 2 bars of the 4 chord with 2 of the 1 chord, and the third phrase moves from the 5 chord back to 1 in bar 11, often through a passing 4 chord that would appear in bar 10. So, to explain chord identification, we demonstrated triad arpeggiation in the first rhythm video. Triads are chords of 3 different pitches that form the basis of tonal music, which is to say, music in which particular tones predominate over others in recognizable relationships. Every major scale contains 7 tones which replicate an octave higher. Each of those tones can be the basis or the root of a triad. And we can build triads on the first scale degree, the second scale degree, the third scale degree, on the fourth, on the fifth, on the sixth, up to the 7th scale degree. And at that point, the triads replicate. The next higher chord would be built on the 1st scale degree. Restricted to the tones of the scale, in other words, proceeding diatonically, some triads will be major and some minor. So let me demonstrate. Given this scale, the triad built on the 1st scale degree is major. The triad built on the 4th scale degree is major, and that built on the 5th scale degree is major. But the triads built on the 2nd, 3rd, and 6th scale degrees, that would be this, and the 3 chord, and the 6 chord, are all minor. But frequently the tones of the scale are altered, as we say chromatically, to change the colors of the chords. And so what I mean by that is, normally if we stick to the diatonic scale, if we remain within the pitches of the major scale, if we move from a 1 chord to a 2 chord, we'll change from a major sonority to a minor sonority. But that 2 chord can be altered from a minor triad to a major triad by raising the 4th scale degree. Here's the 4th scale degree as it is in the major scale. But if we raise that to a pitch that's not in the major scale, we change the color of the 2 chord from minor to major. So a diatonic motion from 1 to 2 takes us to a minor triad, but we might alter that 2 chord to become major, and it makes it a good preparation for the 5 chord. The diatonically major chords built on the 1st, 4th, and 5th scale degrees are the most elemental in the blues and many other forms of tonal music. We have names for these and other diatonic chords based on the tones that serve as their roots. Because the 1 chord is the goal of tonal music, it is called the tonic. The 5 chord is the most powerful in leading to the tonic, so it is called the dominant. The 5 chord leads very strongly to the 1 chord. the dominant to tonic relationship. Because the root of the 4 chord, the 4th scale degree, lies one step below the root of the dominant, the 4 chord is called the subdominant. 4 often prepares a climactic 5 chord. So here's a 4 chord going to a 5 chord. But in the blues, the 5 chord often falls in bar 10 to 4, softening the cadence. The 5 chord goes through 4 to 1. In earlier classical music, that would have been done like this, but it's a bit more heavy-handed in the blues. Progressing 5 to 4 in bar 10 of the blues to 1. If the 5 chord is softened and doesn't pack a strong punch in bars 9 to 11, it often occupies bar 12 as a strong transition to the next chorus, often through a bluesy turnaround like this. This is a gesture that's sped up for the introduction to what is likely the Beatles' favorite Buddy Holly song, That'll Be the Day. Here is a chart showing the 3 phrases of a 12-bar blues. I'll play one chorus of a blues, and you'll see how the bars are counted out. You should also be able to hear the different chord changes as they occur. I played major triads, which form the usual accompaniment for the blues, but the melodic material I played drew from what we call the minor pentatonic scale because of the nature of its 5 different pitches. This is also typical of the blues, as both sung melodies and solo instrumental parts will feature the lowered scale degrees of the minor pentatonic. And those often clash against the major sonorities of the underlying accompaniment. There's a major triad, and we'll often get minor pentatonic tones against that. And they clash when heard together. One thing I like to do with students who've never touched a musical instrument in their lives is to sit down at the left side of the piano and hammer out a 12-bar blues in E-flat major. And they can play anything they like on the black keys of the piano, which naturally spell an E-flat minor pentatonic scale. They can't go wrong and can often become quite expressive musically after 1 or 2 choruses, like this. This sort of play is how the Beatles learned their guitar fingerboards, and it's also the basis of highly skilled playing by Robert Johnson and Eric Clapton and Jack White, to name a few. In jazz-oriented playing, the blues is often given over to lengthy improvisation, but in most recorded pop, rock, soul, and funk, it is stretched and expanded in terms of phrase rhythm rather than virtuosic display. And I should say that although blues melodies usually ply the minor pentatonic, thoroughly major mode tunes like the verse of Chains and the Beatles' own Flying are also part of our 12-bar repertoire. The Beatles performed many dozens of blues. Between their BBC performances, early Liverpool and Hamburg tapes, and informal hotel room jams, we have recordings of about 30 covers of songs made into 1965 based on 12-bar blues. Most consistently from Chuck Berry, Larry Williams, Little Richard, and Carl Perkins, but also from a long list of other artists, ranging from Little Willie John, whose R&B number, Leave My Kitten Alone, was taped by the Beatles, to pop songs such as Gene Vincent's Bebop-A-Lula, Chan Romero's Hippie Hippie Shake, and the Coasters' Searchin'. The Beatles composed a handful of their own blues, first with Paul's Can't Buy Me Love and John's You Can't Do That from early 1964, and lastly with George's For You Blue from 1969. Even though no sung section of A Hard Day's Night is a 12-bar, its guitar solo is. The blues was originally a strophic form, one 12-bar chorus performed after another without relief, whereas pop song blues adaptations, as true with the Beatles, will usually contrast a 12-bar section against something, a chorus or a bridge, that's very different. Can you hear which sections conform to the 12-bar model and which do not in Nothing Shaken But the Leaves on the Trees, or Honey Don't, or You Can't Do That? Through 1963, however, the Beatles' blues material is relentlessly 12-bar. Both verses and choruses conform in Chuck Berry's Little Queenie, Too Much Monkey Business, I Gotta Find My Baby, and Carol, and in Carl Perkins' Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby and Matchbox. One element of variety involves where a stop time passage may occur. A favored location is through the first 3 bars, the way Long Tall Sally, Clarabella, and Boys are punctuated. And I'll play the opening of Long Tall Sally to remind you what that stop time sounds like in the first 3 bars. Stop time prepares bar 5 in Searchin' and Slow Down, and is held in reserve until bar 11 in Nothing Shaken But the Leaves on the Trees and Ooh, My Soul. The different eruptions of stop time either prevent the song from getting a steady start or put a sudden spotlight on the singer's exasperated verse endings. Another construction that can differ from blues to blues is the presence of a refrain, which is a line, often containing the song's title, that appears within a verse or other section, usually forming its conclusion. Roll Over Beethoven is like the traditional bar form blues, in which the first 2 phrases have varied lyrics in each verse, but the last 4 bars constitute a recurring refrain, in this case, as usual, featuring the title. In Take Out Some Insurance on Me, Baby, and in Searchin', however, bars 1 through 4 are different in each verse, but 5 through 12 make up an 8-bar long recurring refrain. The same is true of Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, Long Tall Sally, Money, and Boys, where the refrain is marked by the bop shoo up backing vocals, all as diagrammed here, very different from the AAB model. The 12-bar parentage is barely concealed when bars 11 and 12 are repeated to become bars 13 and 14 in Chuck Berry's Rock and Roll Music. But the blues will be greatly stretched and disfigured in late 1965's Day Tripper. The Beatles create only a half dozen 12-bar blues of their own, but their songs are influenced by it in melodic material, which is to be covered in another video, and in design. The bar form, AAB structure of the blues, is the basis of both Thank You Girl and I Want to Hold Your Hand, both of which have verses composed as shown here. A repeated 4-bar phrase followed by a contrasting 4-bar refrain, even though the major scale melodies and very different chord schemes seem very far removed from the typically minor inflected blues. In the first rhythm video, 1.2, we noted that the "I Want to Hold Your Hand" refrain, bars 9 through 12, is marked by faster harmonic rhythm than that which governs bars 1 through 8. The same three-phrase bar form structure, AAB, will later control Paul's verse of "We Can Work It Out" and John's verse in "I'm So Tired." The second small form we wish to look at is known as the period. This combines two phrases, the first one ending questioningly on the dominant chord for what we call a half cadence. So the first phrase in a period might do something like this. Half cadence ending on the dominant. And an answering phrase will conclude on a motion from the 5 chord to 1, what we call an authentic cadence, the dominant chord going to the tonic chord. So the answering phrase might do something like this. The two phrases are called the antecedent and the consequent, labels that explain their functional relationship. This diagram, which we call a bubble chart, shows the construction of the verse in From Me to You. The antecedent phrase proceeds for 4 bars, ending on the dominant chord, like this. The consequent phrase answers this by concluding with 5 resolving to 1, like this. The lyrics fit the musical sense. The first antecedent phrase raises the question of what the listener wants. The second consequent phrase answers the question with the singer promising to send along his love. The two phrases together form a satisfying period. The song's middle section, on the other hand, forms a different sort of open-ended phrase group by ending on an unresolved dominant harmony, and we'll take a closer look at that in a minute. See if you can hear how the verses of "I Saw Her Standing There," "Till There Was You," and "Little Child" each combine 2 8-bar phrases that function as antecedent and consequent to form a period. Phrases will normally contain a symmetrical 4 or 8 bars, but the Beatles are unusual in exploring very flexible phrase rhythms. For instance, "It Won't Be Long" has verses of 3 plus 4 bars, and "Not a Second Time" has highly irregular 4-phrase verses of 7 plus 7 plus 4 plus 6. In addition to the 12-bar blues and the period, a third important way to group phrases into a section, what I call the SRDC, will be covered in a later video. For now, we'd like to focus on the most significant large forms that work as complete sections of songs: the verse, chorus, bridge, and the instrumental break. The verse is the song section that recurs but with varied lyrics. It is often heard twice before a contrasting chorus or bridge appears. There are often 3 sets of lyrics for different verses appearing in a given song, but there may be more or fewer than 3. In rare cases, such as "Love Me Do" or "Little Child," the words do not change at all when the music returns, so the definition of verse is not fully met. Many early Beatles songs have little variety among the verse lyrics. If part of the verse lyric is different in recurrences, but part is unchanging, that constant part is called the refrain, and as in "Misery," the refrain usually provides the song's title. Multiple sets of lyrics in different verses usually comprise different examples of whatever concept or theme is described by the title. In rock and roll music, for instance, each verse lists the kind of music the singer does or does not want to hear, and the chorus hammers it home that he only wants to hear rock and roll. Sometimes the different sets of verse lyrics are strung together to tell a story, as in I Saw Her Standing There. In the two non-blues bar form examples, Thank You Girl and I Want to Hold Your Hand, the first two phrases have new lyrics from verse to verse, but the third phrase, constant in each verse, is the refrain from which the title is drawn. We mentioned before that if a refrain is present, it usually concludes the verse. All I've got to do is unusual in its title appearing in the middle of the verse, each one of which follows a 4-bar antecedent with a 2-bar refrain, and then a 5-bar consequent. Verses tend to end on the tonic, as do all periods, but sometimes they do not. The verses of Do You Want to Know a Secret and Twist and Shout end on 5 chords. In some cases, the second verse will end differently than did the first. Ask Me Why and There's a Place extend their second verses before going to contrasting sections, creating highly unusual and, in retrospect, one might say youthfully undisciplined structures. Songs can be made up of verses alone, and these examples are called strophic. Folk music is typically strophic, and Bob Dylan produced about 50 such songs in the 1960s, sometimes extended for 5 or more verses, which in and of themselves might be complex, but which are not juxtaposed against contrasting material. John Lennon would produce a few strophic songs as a solo artist, but this is not of interest to the Beatles except when covering certain Chuck Berry songs such as Memphis. Much more typically, the verse will alternate with a chorus. The two sections will have a different texture, usually marked by varying the arrangements of backing vocals, but perhaps set off from each other by a different strumming or picking pattern in George's guitar, or contrasting use of Ringo's drum set. In A Taste of Honey, the meter changes from triple in the verses to a shuffling quadruple for the chorus. Often, the chorus is a showcase for greater volume. If the verse lacks a refrain, you can bet that the song's title will be prominent in the chorus. Chuck Berry songs sometimes have a chorus, as does rock and roll music. The verses and choruses are represented here in the order in which they appear, easily identified as separate sections by the 3-bar stop time passage that introduces each. Another Chuck Berry song with a chorus is Johnny Be Good. Its Go Johnny Go section recurs, alternating with verses to tell the life story. Please Mr. Postman and Twist and Shout are very unusual in opening with choruses instead of with 1 or 2 verses, as is usually done. A number of early original Beatles songs lack a chorus, but they can be heard in Don't Bother Me, only 4 bars long there, I Want to Be Your Man, which simply repeats the title over and over, It Won't Be Long, recapturing the backing vocals yeah, yeah, yeahs of She Loves You, and in a much more muted vein, Ask Me Why, in which the chorus features the same sensitive alternation of 3 and 4 chords to which John would return 2 years later for the Nowhere Man bridge. And the bridge is the section to which we now turn our attention. The Beatles often referred to this passage as the middle 8, but as it just as often had a number of bars other than 8, we'll avoid that misleading label. The core function of the bridge is to provide relief from the verses and/or choruses. It often begins with a thinner texture. Ringo might quietly tap a closed hi-hat. George might move from playing chords to playing strings one at a time. John might sing in a lower, more inwardly personal register. Or the rhythm might introduce variety, as with the triplets that are heard in the bridge of Ask Me Why. But the bridge will often end forcefully, the vocals spilling over with emotion as all the energy is concentrated on the return of the following verse. This dynamic growth is usually outlined harmonically. The bridge often begins on a relaxed 4 chord and leads to a propulsive 5 chord. Let me show you how that works. Let's say you have a second verse that ends with an authentic cadence. You then soften that tonic chord at the end of that authentic cadence, and that leads to the 4 chord, which begins the bridge in a very relaxed harmonic place. But the bridge builds in intensity to a propulsive 5 chord at the end of the bridge. Because it usually ends on 5, the bridge is rarely a closed period, but usually a harmonically open phrase group. The 4 chord is often softened by tones lowered from the scale, specifically by removing the home key's dynamic 7th scale degree and replacing it with the flatted 7th scale degree, which resolves into a member of the 4 chord. Here, I'll show you what I mean. Here's your tonic chord from the cadence, and the home key's 7th scale degree, the diatonic 7th scale degree, is that. It's actually part of the dominant harmony, and so leads very forcefully back to the 1 chord. But if we lower that 7th scale degree out of the major scale, out of the diatonic system, we're replacing the dynamic upwards motion that the natural 7th scale degree has and give it a downwards motion, which helps it resolve into a member of the 4 chord. Paul McCartney, in talking about this flatted 7th scale degree, said that the change of scale was like going to another world. He was talking about the opening of the bridge of From Me to You, but that sound was still in his ear 5 years later when he used it to enter into the bridge of Hey Jude. In contrast to this flatting of a scale degree, the 5 chord, to which the 4 chord eventually leads, is often intensified by chromatically raised tones from outside the scale. So let's say we begin a bridge here with the softened 7th scale degree. There's your 4 chord with which the bridge will begin. We're going to raise that 4th scale degree chromatically from a pitch outside the scale to propel us into the 5th scale degree for the intense end of the bridge. That raised 4th scale degree, you may remember, helps us change the color of the 2 chord from its diatonic minor state to a major state. And it's that major chord built on the 2nd scale degree that helps propel to the dominant chord. So a bridge will often begin in a harmonically relaxed place and then gather energy proceeding to the song's most climactic point. Anna, Go to Him makes for a good example. The 2nd verse ends here with an authentic cadence, and then we move here for the bridge. Did you count those scale degrees up from 1, 2, 3 to 4? And that's where the bridge begins, on the 4 chord, as usual. But when the singer reaches greatest despondency, desperately asking, what am I supposed to do? He does so with the pointedly raised 4th scale degree, which leads to the 5 chord, and John's retransitional descending syncopated triplets on an improvisational R&B signature single-syllable melisma. all on the wailing syllable oh, 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 oh. This technique, which the Beatles practiced in such varied cover songs as Till There Was You, Bésame Mucho, Lend Me Your Comb, and Take Good Care of My Baby, is a large part of what made From Me to You and I Want to Hold Your Hand so exciting. Here's a bubble chart for the bridge of From Me to You, which droops down to the subdominant key, and then intensifies to enter the key of the dominant, and then ratchets up further to pass through a hyper-retransitional dominant augmented chord. And that's the vehicle for John and Paul's harmonized falsetto woos, which would send shivers through a screaming audience. The augmented chord at the end of the bridge may have been suggested by the occurrence of the same sonority in Till There Was You. See if you can find that moment. Much of this plan is already evidenced in the April 1960 recording, You'll Be Mine, but you'd be hard-pressed to concentrate on the song's harmonic accompaniment while Lennon recites his silly spoken lines. This dynamic structure is characteristic of the Beatlemania years. Listen particularly to John's weeping outburst in the retransition at the end of the bridge of This Boy. The effect is left aside as if outgrown in the middle years, and then resurfaces in 1968 in Hey Jude and Back in the USSR. In contrast, the bridges of Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, and even the otherwise taut Please Please Me can seem a bit limp in comparison with their structural closes on static tonic chords. The bridge in I Saw Her Standing There builds to a climactic 5 chord with the falsetto mine, but then backslides to a retransitional 4 chord as a bluesy touch. Here's a question for you. What is the form of the bridge in Thank You Girl? It's an outlier. And another atypical item. What is unusual about the lyrics of the 2 bridges in Little Child? You may have to listen to a good number of Beatles songs before figuring that one out. The Beatles would often fill out a song with an instrumental break, usually a passage for guitar solo based on the verse or bridge structure, for a wordless and thereby unconscious development of the song's ideas. The solo in Don't Bother Me is a straight setting of the verse changes. Not a Second Time takes the last 10 bars of the verse structure and allows George Martin to overdub a sensitive, maybe cheesy piano part. George Harrison improvised many different bluesy solos for I Saw Her Standing There on a passage related to but different from the verse. The 12-bar pattern established within Long Tall Sally, Roll Over Beethoven, and Boys remained intact in their solos. But like its intro, the guitar solo of Money excised bars 5 through 8 of the 12-bar idea. The Beatles might have been thinking Bo Diddley when they took a 12-bar guitar solo in I Want to Be Your Man, all on the tonic 7th chord. Lennon's overdubbed harp solo in Little Child follows the 12-bar structure pretty closely, even though the rest of the song had not even approached that idea. In Twist and Shout, John and George have a duet of nearly identical guitar parts that take off from the chorus structure but draw out a dominant 7th chord for an extra 6 bars, as do the bridge and intro for maximum exhilaration. To sum up, we've covered a number of formal devices and functions in this introductory video. Because the Beatles can create some pretty complex music, it's not always easy to tell, for instance, whether you're hearing a refrain that is really part of a verse, or whether it's a fully independent chorus. All this requires some pretty strong interpretive skills that come with practice. Hopefully, You'll have gained a preliminary understanding of the verse, refrain, chorus, bridge, and instrumental break, and have begun recognizing how these sections relate to each other and how they use musical materials like rhythm, harmony, melody, instrumental technique, and color to create repetition and contrast and support the ideas in the lyrics. It's also important to be able to recognize the 12-bar blues and the related bar form, and the period with its antecedent consequent construction, as these ideas will recur and be altered throughout the Beatles' career. 2 later videos will cover other formal matters that characterize the early music of the Beatles: the SRDC structure in the pre-chorus, the introduction and the coda, the tattoo, the motto, and the riff. We've touched here on diatonic and chromatic chord identity, major and minor triad colors, and the harmonic functions of 1, 4, and 5. And these concepts will be explored further in other videos devoted to the Beatles' treatment of harmony.